and we were very good at time management. We were very good at all of these kinds of things. And so, so suddenly, when we're put into a position where we're having to think about assessment, and we're having to think about somehow proving that we are good enough, we run into these feelings of failure. So think about, just for a minute, what happened the last time you failed? How did that feel? And whatever that means to you in terms of failure, whether it was a manuscript that you submitted that was rejected, or a course proposal that you submitted, your colleague said was terrible and awful, or maybe in your neighborhood you did something and people didn't like it, or what have you. We don't like to fail. And it is embarrassing, and it is something that we work to avoid. So it's no wonder that we don't like failure. We've been taught, our teachers, our parents, everybody has said, don't fail, work harder. If you failed, that somehow you didn't work hard enough, and so it's something about you and something you did, and that becomes just such a huge problem. So when we think about assessment then, think about a situation where the status quo continues because there isn't a real reason to change, even though you know that things could actually be better. And I know on my own campus, there are several of these kinds of situations where either an assessment system is in place because it's always been there, or the process for creating a new program has to go through a ridiculous number of committees and get so many different people to sign off on it, and everybody knows that it's too much and it's not necessary, and yet that's still what we do. We know things could be better, but we decide we're not going to change. We're not going to fix anything. We're going to keep it the way it is. And so when we think about that, it just focus solely on assessment. We can kind of see where this has caused problems. So if we think about assessment, not just in terms of failure, but just assessment in general, assessment is using data and information to inform decision making, which is just straightforward. We get data, and that data helps us make a decision, helps to guide us. It gives us what we need in order to move one way or another. So that seems pretty benign and pretty straightforward, and certainly nothing that would evoke feelings of shame and horror and disappointment and things like that. But if we think about assessment and what assessment really is in terms of the practice of assessment, what we end up with is sometimes just a whole bunch of work that is done that we're not even sure if people are reading what we're writing. Are they responding to what we're seeing? So much work, so much time, so much energy goes into the work that we do with assessment that it isn't just about gathering data to inform decision making. It's more. It's doing things in the right way with the right form and the right format and all of that. And so it becomes this thing that we do mostly for accountability. We talked a little bit about that this morning, kind of the distinction between accountability and improvement. But when we get into thinking about assessment, if we're thinking about assessment as an accountability piece, that means a lot. What that means is that we have to demonstrate that we are truly good enough, and if we're not, then what does that mean? That means it's somebody's fault that we're not good enough. And our initial response, as humans, is to look around and go, well, it's not my fault. It must be your fault or somebody else's fault. It can't be mine because I worked really hard at this. And so this accountability mindset puts us in a place where we're really looking to prove that we're good enough, and if for some reason someone questions that, then it must be somebody else's fault. And that doesn't help us with what the assessment is originally designed to do, which is to provide us data so that we can improve improve our decision making. And so that accountability mindset is one thing, but if we can move ourselves more often into this improvement mindset, then we're looking at something that's transformative. Assessment becomes this process by which we can make things better. And that if it's going to be transformative and we're truly going to think about improvement as being the point, getting that data to inform decisions so that we can improve, then we want to know not only what does work, but we want to most definitely find out what doesn't work. Because if we find out what doesn't work, then we can fix it, we can change it, we can address that issue. And so if we're going to have this improvement mindset, we have to be looking for the things that don't work as well as we want them to, which means asking the hard questions. And of course, if you're in an accountability mindset, you don't want to ask the hard questions. You want to ask the easy questions so you look good and you can move on. But if we're really going to think about assessment as transformative, then we have to ask the hard questions so that we know what we need to improve on. And so that brings us to this idea of a failure paradox, where if we can identify a weakness, it actually makes our system stronger. And so the process of identifying a weakness does not make us weaker. It makes us stronger because then we can address whatever that weakness happens to be. But this only happens if the weakness is real, meaning that it is actually based on valid, reliable data or information. So it's got to be a real weakness, because if it's not, then we can't fix it because it's not real. We have to be able to claim it and have some sense of control over it, because if there's a real weakness and we don't have control over it, then we can't fix it. Now we can pass that information on to others who might be able to fix it, and that can work. But if it's not our problem to fix and we cannot fix it, then we just know that there's a weakness. And I see that sometimes across the board in higher education, where programs will look at students and the students not achieving certain levels, and writing is a great example of that, where students will show up in our programs and they won't have the level or the skill in writing and written communication that often we expect them to have. And so so that can certainly be a weakness, and something that needs to be addressed. But if, as a faculty member in a program, I say, well, it's not my fault that there's this weakness, it's somebody else's fault. It is the English department's fault, or it is the K-12 education, or it is admission's fault for admitting people who can't write, or whatever it is. If we can't control it, we can't fix it. And then all we're left to do is kind of complain about it, which doesn't really help. So we have to claim it, and we have to then have some level of control over that. And if we assign blame for it elsewhere, then again, it's not our problem to fix, so we can't fix it. So that weakness doesn't help make us stronger. It just gives us something to pass on to somebody else. And we have to actually believe that this weakness is important enough to actually make a change. Because there may be some small things that are found that, we could change it or not, no big deal. If it's not important enough to actually make a change, then knowing that isn't really it doesn't provide us with a helpful path to move forward with. So that whole kind of failure paradox only works if we have control over the weakness, and if we care enough about the weakness to truly make a difference with what would happen with a change in that. And that's where assessment becomes truly hugely valuable, because we can find out what doesn't work and then we can address it in ways that do make a difference. And that's why it has to be important enough to do that. And so Carl Rogers said the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. And I think that's one of the things that we have to look at as we're developing and refining our assessment plans, is that, you know, we can sit back all day and wish for the students that we want to have, but the reality is that we teach the students that we have. And that means that we need to look at what we have, and then we can work with changing and improving and enhancing and transforming our educational process, our systems, our courses for our students, and truly make a difference. And I think that assessment helps with that, because it can help us to identify where those weaknesses are, but then it's up to us to recognize that those weaknesses are something that we can address and we can work with. And we're not just going to blame somebody else for them. We're gonna look to see what we can do with that. So sometimes, even though we didn't actually cause a problem, we can be a huge player in fixing that problem. And that's what we need to do. But so often we see assessment really as a punisher. Now I'll give you a little bit of kind of background on me and kind of where I come from. My degree is in educational psychology, but my undergraduate degree was actually behavioral psychology. And so I have done a lot of my theoretical work in the area of behaviorism. And in behaviorism, for those of you who don't know that, because it's kind of an old school term, this is where you look at the environment and you look to see if things are rewarded or reinforced, you get more of them. And if they are, if behavior that is punished, you should see less of that behavior. So when we look at what happens in the world of assessment, often we see people, faculty, institutions, administrators, staff, often working to avoid doing any kind of assessment. Well, the only reason you would do that would be if assessment was in some way a punisher. So how is assessment a punisher? Well, if faculty are in trouble, and I'm going to kind of use that word in quotes, if faculty are in trouble if they don't do the annual assessment report, and I know as an assessment director, I have made all kinds of calls to departments and faculty saying, okay, it's not in yet, why have you not turned this in? You need to turn it in. So if faculty are somehow in trouble because they don't do annual assessment reports, then it could be a punisher. If faculty do the assessment report and spend time doing it, then what are they not spending time on? You might be giving up time for research or scholarly activities or creative activities or teaching time or maybe even time with your family or sleep. And so that could lead us certainly to avoid wanting to do assessment. If your dean or your provost or your president doesn't think that assessment matters, well, then maybe the dean or your provost or whatever would think that faculty are wasting their time spending it doing assessment when they could be doing these other things. Now, here, I think you all are very lucky because you have some wonderful administrators who, many of them are incredibly supportive of assessment and of the assessment process. And I think that is a really helpful thing. But we have to look at what are the reward structures for faculty. And if assessment's not one of those, then it may actually be a punisher. If learning outcomes are written and they're not correct, they're not right, well, maybe they're going to be embarrassed by the assessment office or by an accreditor or by someone who says, oh, no, you didn't use the right form of a verb here. And I have actually seen that happen. There was an institution that I worked with in Texas that wrote all of their learning outcomes for their students in the future tense, and that the student will do whatever. And they were told that wasn't appropriate because it needed to be that the students had already done that. Now, really, the tense of a verb matters, and it doesn't. And so they went back and they spent a lot of time rewriting all of their outcomes in the right tense of a verb, and it just was a huge waste of time for them to do. And so that left a very bad feeling in their just the whole assessment is this horrible process. And so doing things correctly can be a punisher. And if they don't show success, what happens if departments lose funding or budget lines? Oh, well, you're not doing very well, so therefore, your students aren't learning at the level that they should. So we're going to lose funding. We certainly see that at the institution level, with more and more states looking at performance-based funding and looking at completion rates as being a driver of funding, so that if you don't have the right numbers, well, you might lose funding for that. So of course, we're not going to want to show anything that would show us in a negative light. And it can be absolutely humiliating for anyone in a department, individual faculty member, or even the department as a whole, if they're not doing it right. So when we look at all this, it's no wonder that assessment isn't something that most people want to give up their Friday the 13th to talk about. And I see we still got people here listening in on this, and that's a good thing, because, you know, obviously I don't think that assessment should be thought of as a punisher. I think it's very, very different. But there's a reason that I think a lot of people think of assessment negatively, and that's because it has been presented in many instances as a punishment. There was an article in 2017, and the author says the dysfunctionality of assessment today starts with the primacy of evidence and data. And when I first read that, I had to go back and read it like 3 or 4 times to make sure I was not misreading it, because of course the whole point of assessment is that we have evidence and data, and we use that then to help inform the decision making. So for someone to say that makes it dysfunctional is just kind of makes my head explode a little bit. And clearly that would be the case for someone who did not understand how assessment can be transformative, and how assessment is not just simply a punishment. And part of the case that was made in this article is that before we did all this kind of work on providing assessment data and annual reports and all this, we actually knew a lot more about what students were learning, because we were paying more attention to the learning and less attention to the assessment. And so we had more time to spend on learning and discussions of learning. So that the problem was all this data and evidence. And so of course, if that's the mindset of someone, then we actually do see a very dysfunctional system that's an issue with that. You know, just because we have time to do this, I pulled some quotes out of some different articles. This one is from the Chronicle back in 2018. Where Gilbert said, "No doubt many of you will spend part of the month of January looking over assessment material from the fall semester, equipped with some pre and post tests, a couple of artifacts, a rubric, a curriculum map, and perhaps a little bourbon. You will study your data carefully, make a few quick inferences, and then identify a minor problem that you can address by making equally minor changes to your course or program. However, you may find that upon close examination, the data don't seem to be saying anything to you at all. You may even be tempted to just make something up. If you do go that route, it's probably because you have concluded that assessment data do not tell you anything useful about your program, so there's no harm in fudging your analysis of the data." So what do we do with this? That essentially, you know, someone in the Chronicle is telling us that it's really okay to fudge your data because it doesn't really matter anyway, so just cut and paste from last year and we're all good. And that way you've done the accountability piece. Well, that is really not at all good. And Gilbert goes on to say that if that was you, don't worry. It turns out the assessment program your college imposed on you was probably never going to improve anything. Well, that is certainly not the point of assessment. And the fact that there are many who actually see that assessment is something that gets in the way and is imposed on us and is not going to improve anything, then of course it would be a waste of time. And of course it would be a punisher. And of course it would be something that we don't really want to do. And that is truly an issue. Gilbert goes on, it's fairly obvious that assessment has not caused and probably will not cause positive changes in student learning. And because it's clear that this has been an open secret for a while, one wonders why academic administrators have been so acquiescent about assessment for so long. So here's the thing. Some of that may actually be true. Because, I know what, really? Because there are assessment reports that are actually done that way, where no real thought has gone into it and no real discussion of analytics and looking at what it means happens. And in that case, you know, is assessment really dysfunctional? And you know, the answer actually can be yes, and the answer can be no. I have seen many dysfunctional assessment systems. But I also believe, and I believe this very, very strongly, that if we're going to spend time doing this, which we have been and we are, and we will continue to do, then it needs to be worth that time. And how do we make it worth that time? Well, we make it actually useful. We make it formative. We make it something where we actually can make a difference with what we're doing. So even though not everyone is doing that, I think that we need to really look carefully at how we can use assessment as a tool to improve, and that we see it as a way to find what isn't working so that we can fix what isn't working. And that becomes very, very important. But if all we want is compliance, then we're not going to get growth. So the whole compliance piece becomes problematic, because then you're just showing that you're good enough, and we're not going to get that growth. And if we shut down truth, we can't expect that we're going to get honesty in assessment reports. And faculty and administration and programs aren't going to do something if it's not worth their time. So we have to reward growth and change if that's what we truly want. We have to really set up our assessment processes and the way we do it within our departments, and certainly within the institution, but within the departments, so that it's not just about getting a report done because we were told to do it by a particular date. And that often happens, you know, by one person who doesn't really share a lot with the others in the department, not because they're trying to keep it secret, but because often we're trying to help. And so if I can just kind of do that all, then no one else has to worry about it, and then it's just, you know, I'll do it, and I'll take that for the team, and everybody appreciates it. But if we're not actually using our data, if we're not really looking to see it, having those discussions and making it worthwhile, then it does truly become something that is dysfunctional, because it's not working for us, and it's not giving us what we need to have. And so when we look at kind of where we are, Judith Eaton wrote an article on disruption in the accreditation space, where she talked about the federal government taking on the primary oversight of accreditation and defining what quality means and what student success means, and changing the to whom part of to whom accreditation is accountable. If we are accountable as faculty to our students, to our colleagues, and to our institution, and within our higher ed place, then we are typically going to try and continue to make things better. If we are accountable to the federal government or an outside third-party organization, then we're going to try and give them what they need to have, which becomes compliance, which isn't really the kind of helpful piece that we really should be focusing on for transformation and for improvement, and for the things that assessment has always been able to do. So when we look at this accountability model, assessment's mandated, it becomes a documented practice, and we comply. And the policies that are written often look for relatively simple metrics that are relatively inexpensive to do, and inexpensive not just in terms of the funds that go in them, but the time that takes to do some of those. So if we're looking for just simple metrics, we're not going to be able to really get at the deep meaning in education, the things that are really important to us as educators about what students are learning and how students are learning. So what we get is what is sometimes seen as a meaningless, bureaucratic set of data collections. that, that don't do what is supposed to happen. So when we see assessment used for punishment, and regional accreditors are often a piece of that. And just so that you know, I've been a peer reviewer for HLC and an evaluator for SACS, and I chair committees for SACS, and I work really closely with several of the regional accreditors, and accreditors, for the most part, don't just want the compliance. They really do want real change, but it's hard to do when you try and scale that up. And so it comes across as really looking for that compliance. And so if we're doing assessment for that, then it's top down, it's mechanistic, and it becomes added on to everything that we're already doing. And so you have to make a choice. Do I want to do this assessment work, or do I want to do my real job? And as soon as you're trying to make that case, well, you know, assessment does not become the primary focus. And of course, the case I tried to make this morning is that assessment is about learning, and that is our primary focus. And so if we can move outside of this accountability model, we're actually going to be in a much better place to be able to really truly make a difference. And so that's what transformative assessment is all about. So that assessment enhances learning. Assessment is not an end in itself, and it becomes this cyclical process, so that we do it, and we do it in a way that keeps providing us with data and information that we can discuss and decide what to do with, so that it becomes integrated into just the regular cycle of everything that we do. And it becomes part of our ongoing dialogue. So then if the focus is on how can we better improve student learning, well, that's a fantastic and exciting conversation to have. And if that is happening on campuses and within departments, then you know that is a program that is really growing and expanding and doing some incredibly exciting things. So if we've got transformative assessment, we've got something where the outcomes and the goals are aligned with the institutional mission. It becomes a very collaborative process that is consistent and systematic, but it's also appropriate and realistic, so that it doesn't become this massive thing that has to be done. It's part of everything because it's authentic, and we're using things in a lot of different ways, so it becomes sustainable, and it's meaningful, that we want to know. We want to see what happens. We want to know that students are learning. And that is when we can really get into this transformational approach to it, rather than the accountability piece. And so when we look at failure and what that often means to us, often we don't see the hard work that goes into success. We see that somebody did something so easily, but we don't see all the preparation and the work that goes into that. Often people who are kind of avoiding something just kind of stop trying, and they won't even attempt something if they think they might fail. Because no one wants to be seen as incompetent. We are competent people. Faculty and administrators or people in higher ed are very competent people, and we like that. And we certainly don't want somebody to think we don't know what we're doing or what we're talking about. And so what that means is that failure is something that we work to avoid, but we don't necessarily have to, because that failure is something that will tell us what we're not doing well, so that we can then improve and transform. So that failure piece is really essential to understanding student learning that happens. And if you think about it, if you think back, if you've ever had your own child or watched other children, when they're starting to learn to walk, the first time they sort of pull themselves up on their feet, what's going to happen next? Well, they're gonna fall down, because that's how you learn to walk. You get up and you fall, and then you get up and you fall, and you get up and you fall. And no one has ever looked at that, and the first time a almost toddler, falls down and said, oh, that poor child, never gonna learn to walk. Nobody says that, because that's part of the process. You get up and you fall, you get up and you fall, and then you get better and better and better and better. And that's the thing that when we look at that, we don't look at a toddler falling down as a failure. We look at that as part of the overall process. And so what we're really seeing here is productive failure. Failure that actually leads to something, that it's not just oh, you can't do it. It's okay, this didn't work, so let's try it again. And that idea of productive failure is something that we really want to see more embedded into the assessment process, so that we look for these things where we're not doing as good of a job as we'd like to do, or our students are not learning as much as they want to do. Then we can approach it and we can fix it, but only if we know that that's what is happening. So that productive failure is something that we really should be looking at. John Dewey said that failure is instructive. The person who really thinks learns quite as much from his failures as from his successes. And so we want to see failure, because that tells us what to fix, and then we fix it, and then we're still looking, what else can we fix? What else can we do? How else can we continue to improve? Because the reality is, with education, we're never going to fix everything. We're never going to make everything the best it can ever be. There's always room for improvement. There's always something that we can do more of, or differently, or what have you. And as soon as we stop looking at that growth mindset, essentially, we're going to start to stagnate, and that's not a good place for education to be. We need to be looking for these things. So how do we do that? I believe that we should set the assessment bar high. In other words, we should have aspirational learning outcomes and goals, and knowing that not every student is going to meet them. Because we want to set it high enough so that this is what we're working toward. This is what we'd like to see. We really do want them to be aspirational, and that means we have to reward failure and improvement. So I think one of the most exciting things that I see come out of any departmental assessment report is something that didn't work, and they had a plan to fix it, or to improve it, or to address it, and they tried the plan, and they went back and measured again, and sure enough, it's better. Or maybe it's not better, so they try something else, and they go back, and eventually it will get better. They will improve, and so that becomes this whole ongoing cyclical process of assessment. That it's not just a 1 year at a time thing. It's a 1 year, which leads into the next, which leads into the next, and the next, because it is truly a formative process. So we have to look at that process, not just the final report. And the final report has its place, but the final report should lead into the next year's work that will lead into another final report. So we are always going to be having that cycle of improvement, I hope. And that means that often institutions have to, and departments and programs have to schedule opportunities to find ways to improve, which I think becomes a great topic for departmental faculty to talk about. What did we see last year in our students? What didn't work as well as we wanted it to do? What could we do differently to make that happen? And if we actually schedule those opportunities within department meetings, within curriculum meetings, within assessment meetings in general, what we are able to do is to really look to intentionally find ways to improve. And so it's important that we give feedback that shows that we don't want to give feedback that shows that failure isn't acceptable. So if, and I worked with a dean at one point, and this has been many years ago, where when a department would submit a report that had an outcome not fully met, the dean's response was, go back and do it again. This is not acceptable. So what the departments did is they just kind of lowered the bar, so they always met everything, and so that made the dean happy, and that was all good. And of course, we had nothing that was actually transformative because the departments weren't setting those aspirational goals. So we want to make sure that we set a situation where this idea of failure is acceptable. It's an opportunity then for improvement. And also, we don't want to make failure the cause of having to do more work. So, so if we do something, it doesn't work very well, and so the punishment for that is, well, you got to go do it again, or you got to add more, or you have to do a more work with that. And with accreditation, if an institution is falling short on some of the standards, there's a reports have to be submitted more regularly. So you have to do more work because you failed. So of course that means another reason to not show failure, which gets in the way of transformation. And so really what all this is saying is that we have got to stop looking for these little minor, easily measured outcomes, because learning is big, it's messy, it's exciting. It is something that is absolutely the most wonderful thing that we can do. And it means that sometimes that is messy, and it doesn't look good, and it doesn't measure easily. So we've got to stop trying to find these simple measures and really look at what's important and what we need to be doing. And so fear of failure actually holds us back from change. And it becomes a problem that gets in the way of transformation and improvement. So we set things with the bar too low, and then we hide things or don't send them forward where we have not done as good of a job as we should have done. And so fear of failure becomes a real problem. An article came out in 2014 that said that basically to improve quality, higher education must be able to demonstrate learning improvement. And to do so, academic degree program leaders must assess learning, intervene, and then reassess to determine if the intervention was indeed an improvement, which is, of course, our assessment cycle and that whole closing the loop that you've heard discussed so many different times. And so we've got to be able to identify things where we're falling short so that we can intervene. And then we've got to see if it actually gets better or not. So my quick story here. So when my daughter was young, she's now 20 years old. So, but when she was young, baby, and she would get a temperature, and she'd run a fever, and I'd take her temperature, and then I'd look at her temperature and say it was 102.7. Well, that's pretty high. So as a good parent, what do? I don't just go, that's interesting, and put the data away and put it somewhere. No, I do something. I use that data to make a change. I give her Tylenol, I give cold water, whatever, and then what do? I reassess. I take her temperature again. Did it go down? If it went down, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. If it didn't, then I'm going to try something different, and I'm going to work to do that. I think that we essentially have an ethical responsibility to use our data to improve, and I think we must do that. So we're going to have to reframe this idea of assessment, that it's not top down, it's not a one-time thing, it's not something we do for our accreditor. What it is useful to teaching and learning. It's not as hard as we sometimes turn it into being so difficult. And assessment, if it's done right and is transformative, is absolutely worth the effort that we put into it. So we've got to create an environment where failing is used for learning. I think we can tie this to budgets, that if we can reward the use of failure to lead to improvement, and we're looking at that improvement and that enhancement, then that's something that we should fund. And if we don't do that, then we're only gonna get reports that show everything is fine and all the good stuff that doesn't actually lead us to see change. And so we've got to be able to have these formative assessment processes that allow for that improvement and that piece of all of this. So if we're going to learn to walk, we got to try. We got to fall down. We got to get back up. We got to do it again. And that's the process of assessment. And that's the process of learning, is that we will get better and we will improve. But we've got to be able to get through this idea of failure. So Elon Musk said that failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you're not innovating enough. And I think this is a really interesting concept, because we want to be innovative, but that means sometimes we're going to fail. And I think we have to be okay with that. So what I want you to think about as we kind of end this session is what do you want to take from this? What do you want to change in the way you address assessment, the way you think about assessment? What are you going to bring back to your departments to talk about how assessment and data that you're already collecting and that you're already doing, how that makes a difference and how that really becomes something even more? And just think, what could happen if we actually could make this work? What would happen in higher education if we did this across the country and really, really made a huge difference? Eleanor Roosevelt said that you gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You must do the thing which you think you cannot do. And I think that when we look at assessment and assessment for learning and assessment for transformation, and the idea that we're going to fail sometimes and we're going to find things that don't work, and that's okay, that's part of really what we need to focus on. And when we look at assessment as a teaching and learning tool, the Latin root of the word is actually means to sit beside. And so we're sitting beside our students. And we're looking at improvement and enhancement and all of those things that we hope to see more of. And that becomes this amazing transformative assessment process that is so very, very important. Because together, we can absolutely do this. And we can make a difference, and we can change the lives of our students through looking at how we can do an even better job of educating the students that we have and bringing them into the future. And that becomes our job. So at this point, we got a question.
It's in a private chat here. She didn't ask it to the group. How do you see, from Rachel, how do you see productive failure fitting into the state of Florida's performance funding model, where top performing universities receive additional funding and lower performing schools have their funding reduced?
And I think this is one of the big issues that we're seeing in higher education is this focus on metrics that don't necessarily tell the whole story. And I think that, Florida and other states, Texas is falling close behind Florida in this, where we're looking to reward these good performing institutions, which means less money for everybody else. But part of that is that the metrics we're using don't really tell our whole story. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is do a better job of educating others in the legislature, in our communities, in the the elected positions, about what we really do, and that some of these metrics for compliance and success, when we only look at graduation rates and we only look at retention rates, we lose the chance of looking at the pieces behind that of what we're really doing. And I think many of the institutions that are not always, they're not in the top tier of some of the rankings, and they always want to move up, which is most of us always, is that we work with students who are not necessarily the top performing students always across the board, and we bring them from where they are to in much better ways than other institutions who might show as being more of that kind of high performing and top performing. And because we can't really share that, and that's not understood always by some of our legislators, we get performance funding that focuses only on improvement. And so that's my little,
I'm gonna pull up another chat from here.
So that's my little soapbox though on that one. Sorry about that.
And then from Dean, I should comment that the program outcomes at FIU are directly tied to these performance outcomes, student retention, four-year graduation. We are not allowed to fail.
And I completely understand that, and that's how those are written. But there are other metrics that we can actually look at and communicate those to expand that story. Because I think that I really do believe this, that when people fully understand the complexity of higher education and the work that we're doing with students and the way that we're working with students, that if we can show that bigger story, that bigger picture, then we will be able to make others see that the story isn't just about these graduation rates and retention rates. But I agree. Right now, sometimes you've got to play the game the way it's played at the institutional level, and I think that I'll make a distinction between the institutional level reporting that's often done and what's happening within our programs. Because I do think that within our programs we have a lot more flexibility than the institutions have as they provide information to the state or to the federal government. So at that, we're actually out of time with this one.
We're going to take a short 10-minute break and we'll be back.
Hope to see you all in the next one.
Oh wait, hold on. We have one more question here. Oh, can you elaborate on the budget-related bullet point rewarding failure?
Oh, so great question. So when what I really meant by that was within an institution, we have ways to be strategic about how we use our budgets. And the similar way the state has about how they use their budgets for institutions, I think the institution can do that with programs. And it depends, if we want to use budget to reward improvement, then we want to be able to look for programs that are showing where they might not have met all their outcomes, but they have a plan in place to improve that, and they're doing that and it's working. As now a dean, I would want to put money into that program to see the improvement rather than trying to than having money go into a program that's meeting all their outcomes and isn't necessarily working to improve. They're just doing what they're doing, and clearly they must have enough funding to do what they're doing because they're doing it. Now I know that's not always true, but I really think if we use the budget as a way to reward improvement rather than rewarding just success, that we can do more with that funding. And that's what I meant by that particular comment.
Okay, if there are no more questions, we're going to take our little break and then we'll be right back.